So, based on yesterday's conversation about working memory and the questions I got about working memory, I thought rather than dive right in and talk about attention, let's press pause on attention for a while and spend some more time thinking about working memory, because there are some really important, deep questions about it. And I want to be sure that we don't go to the next topic without having gotten to a really good place on this one. So I want to take a little while to do that. The newsletter sign up made it about halfway around, so I'm going to pass this around again if people want to sign up for that. Okay, so take a minute, see if you can remember and fill in what the 3 key mind-brain education principles are. Can I see a show of fingers? How many of you got 1 of them or 2 of them or 3 of them? How many do you feel like you got? I'm seeing a couple of 1s. I'm seeing a couple of 2s. I'm inferring a couple of 0s. So what's number 1? Don't just do this thing. Think this way. Don't just do this thing. Think this way. You heard me say that a lot yesterday. I'm going to keep saying it today. The news from psychology and neuroscience world is very practically helpful, but not always here's a script to follow. Much more often, if we think about the question the way they thought about it, we're going to get to a good answer. Principle number 2, your mission is not to obey. Your mission is to translate. Use your experience. Use your experience. Listen to the message and say, I'm teaching science to 2nd graders. Since that's what I do, this research means this in my world. And by the way, I'm teaching science to 2nd graders at a school with a particular mission. So that information has this effect in my world. Number 3.
No one is average.
No one is average. Average exists. Nobody is average. You will always see a range. This is true for the working memory research. This is true for the motivation research. This is true for the attention research. It's true for the long-term memory research. All of the graphs you see are always averages. Averages exist. Nobody is average. How many verbs have you got? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so say it with me. Working memory is a short-term memory system that very good. Selects, holds, reorganizes, and combines information from multiple sources. So let's see what you can do with this bad boy. Oh, you're a slide ahead. We haven't anticipated yet. You have anticipated the anticipating. It is crucial. It is limited. And we can't increase it. It's going to develop on its own. 11th graders have more than 5th graders do, but there's nothing artificial we can do to enhance it. So this, I suspect, try not to look at the page. See how many of those you can pull up. See what you can do. This is going to be a challenge. That's okay. See how many of those blanks you can fill in. Hard, isn't it? All right, let's start up in the top corner here. So there are different kinds of working information overload. So how might I overload my students' working memory with information? Too much new information, related or unrelated information, and combinations of information. There are 4 dark sides of the force. Do you remember what they are? Technology can be a dark side of the force. Instructions can be a dark side of the force. Choices can be a dark side of the force. Metacognition can be a dark side of the force. And just to be clear, what that means is that you should never use any of those things, right? No, I'm not saying don't do that. I'm saying be aware. If you're going to add the technology piece to the lesson, ask yourselves what are the potential working memory hazards here and how do you counteract them? Instructions are a good thing. Too many instructions are a bad thing. How do you manage the too many instructions? So these aren't bad, but like the force, they can be used for evil. The 2 perfectly obvious things that are bad for working memory. Stress is very bad for working memory. Being tired is very bad for working memory, okay? When we're identifying, holding while processing, so you remember poor Joe raising his hand and he's clinging so hard to the question he can't process what I'm saying. We talked briefly about atypical distractibility. We'll come back to that in the morning. And this very fun phrase, which I like so much, catastrophic failure. Okay. And then we spent a chunk of time thinking about a whole bunch of solutions once we've anticipated problems, once we've identified problems. What actually do we do to solve the problems? Okay. Several really thoughtful questions. My impression is that the parking lot system is working, so we're going to keep doing that. So one question I really liked, I liked all of them, but this one I thought would be good to kick off a conversation with. Is there a way to have children engaged in learning activities that are higher on Bloom's taxonomy level without taxing working memory? That's a really interesting question. So take a couple minutes at your tables, talk to each other. Why does the questioner assume that higher on Bloom's taxonomy is a working memory tax? Sort of what's the thought process? Go back to your 4 verbs. Think about, are those 4 verbs going to be taxed by higher levels? And are there ways to ensure that being higher on Bloom's taxonomy does not tax or overtax working memory? Is that question clear? Okay. Let's take 3 minutes. Go. Okay, welcome back. So just to check in, is the presumption of the question, the question presumes that the higher on Bloom's taxonomy you go, the higher the working memory demand, or certainly the top levels have more working memory involved than the lower levels. Is that a true presumption? Yeah. If you are creating and analyzing and evaluating, there's a whole lot more, especially reorganizing and combining going on. When we talked about potential working memory overload, the third of the information overload was new combinations. So we're especially in evaluate and create, we're getting into new combinations. So yes, that's absolutely true. So taxing is a very interesting verb to have here. Taxing is okay. It's overtaxing that you want to avoid. And that distinction is a very subtle one. We, of course, want our students to be using working memory. That's a good thing. The danger is when we tip over into the realm of working memory overload and catastrophic failure. And managing that balance is the art in the world of teaching. We're going to use the science, but the teaching itself is an art. This, to me, connected quite marvelously with this question. What's the role of memorization in this process? In Bloom's taxonomy world, what is memorization helping with?
Not taxing over, not taxing over.
Which of those levels is it working on?
Remember.
It's working on remember. One of the interesting things, so one thing to say, by the way, Bloom's taxonomy isn't a psychology construct, it's an education construct. So this isn't something that psychologists think about much. One of the inferences that we often draw is that because this is at the bottom, it's the least important. It's at the bottom because it's foundational. You can't do the other things without it. If you can't remember the stuff, you can't do all of the other things. So one of the advantages of memorization, this is why I was talking with Kevin about decide what the key things are and be sure your students know them cold. If they know the key things cold, it will be much easier to do all of these other things that we want them to do. It's really hard to do creative thinking if I don't actually know the stuff. In cognitive science world, the people who say you don't need to know it, you can just look it up on the Google, it's just not true. It actually has to be in your long-term memory for you to think effectively with it. You have to know it to do the other stuff. Looking it up on the Google isn't going to work. A different way to think about this is the journey, this process back and forth from long-term memory to working memory is quite seamless and simple. When I asked you what the capital of California was, like boom, you just got that. The journey from here to here, the blue arrows, that's a much more complicated process, and that's where the Google is. So as much as we can, we want stuff here if we want them to do advanced cognition with it. What's the right number of things to have students memorize? Sorry? On? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not doing the microphone. The answer is absolutely it depends. It depends on how old your students are. It depends on what you're teaching them. It depends on the complexity of the material. It depends on what you want them to do with it. Researchers cannot answer that question. Only you know, here are the things that they gotta know to be able to do the thinking work I want them to do. And those are the things to have them memorize. I talked with a student a few months ago who told me she'd just taken a test in chemistry where she'd been required to memorize the property of 60 chemical elements. Since I spoke with that student, I have polled, if you're a chemistry teacher, come talk to me at the break, because I'm curious to hear this. I have yet to meet the chemistry teacher who thinks that's a good idea. I sort of get memorizing chemical properties of 3 or 4 or 5 chemical elements, like knowing that stuff for oxygen is good. 60? Do you really need 60? That just seems crazy to me. So it's super easy to go too far in memorization world, but to some degree, some simple memorization of the key stuff you gotta know will reduce working memory load. And based on my just overhearing conversations as I was walking around, people were coming up with other solutions to reduce working memory load to make this creative work possible. Okay, so those were a couple of questions. One question was about what do I mean by offloading stress with writing? This comes under the heading, stress is bad for working memory. So what do we do to help students with stress? This is, I think, one of the reasons that second grade teachers are good at teaching second grade is second grade teachers know how to help second graders manage stress. I'd be very bad at that. Like second graders aren't my world, I just don't know that. High school students, I know how to do that. I'm good with kids that age, that's fine. I know how to josh them out of stress, often. This is a fun research pool. This is work done by Ramirez, and her co-author is Sian Bailock, who's now the president of Barnard. So these are thoughtful people doing this research. In this research, here's the thought process. Why do you feel better? Why does one feel better after one sees a therapist? One of the potential answers to the question is, well, you go talk to the therapist and you dump all the garbage. Like, you just dump. And because you've dumped, you feel better. So maybe if we gave students a chance to dump before they do something, they would feel better. So they tried this a couple times in the psychology lab. They gave students a stressful thing to do. And half of them, before they did that, they did some neutral writing prompt, I don't remember what it was, describe a movie you've seen recently or something like that. And the other writing prompt was take 10 minutes to write about whatever you're thinking and feeling right now, which is a way to say, go ahead and dump. Oh, that's the song, isn't it? I never realized, go ahead and dump, right? Who sings that? You know what I mean. Okay, Van Halen. So they found it worked really well in the psychology lab, so they went to the local high school and they tried it with 9th graders learning biology, and the results were simply not credibly good. They simply did not believe their own data. So they ran the study a second time the following year, and they got the same results. So having done it 4 times, they finally published the research. So these are students in the fall, winter, spring grades. These, by the way, are only the high anxiety students, not regular anxiety students. These are high anxiety students. So those were the grades for the students who did not end up doing the stress dumping. We divided them into 2 groups, we tracked their grades, and for these students before the exam, they described the movie they'd seen recently. The other grades that I'm going to show you, these are the people who took 10 minutes to write about whatever you're thinking and feeling. Their grades on the final exam went up 5 points. That's a huge difference on a final exam just because I got to dump the stuff. Again, you will translate this. How does this work in your world? It will depend how it works in your world. A buddy of mine said, he works in a dormitory, and one of the students he most admires, every night when she sits down to do homework, she takes out a piece of paper and she goes, ah, and she dumps everything, and then she throws the piece of paper away and she does her homework. She just figured that out on her own. So that's what I mean by offload stress with writing. Parenthesis, that's a little bit of a controversial research pool. So you might read people who say, oh, that study is false. There is controversy about it. I'm persuaded enough to show it to you. If I weren't persuaded, I wouldn't show it to you. If you want to, yes?
I actually read an article recently about that same strategy for sleep issues.
Sorry. I read an article recently about that same strategy for sleep issues.
Oh, that's
That
interesting.
before going to sleep at night, to just write and sort of dump whatever, and then go to bed.
Great. If you could send that to me, that would be very helpful.
I would if I could find it.
Okay, that would be great. I'd love to see that. While we're talking about writing, one of the points up here has to do with note-taking as a way to distribute working memory load across visuals and verbals. So an important point about note-taking. When students take notes, think of the working memory demands. They're using working memory to understand what I'm saying. They're using working memory to decide what to write down. They're using working memory to reword what I'm saying into fewer words so they can write it. They're using working memory actually to do the writing. And while they're doing all of that, they're continuing to use working memory to understand what I'm saying, and they are continuing to use working memory to decide what they'll write down after what they're writing down right now. Does that sound like a massive working memory threat? It sure does. So I'm not much into rules. It's rare that I say really, really, really do or don't do this. Here's as close as I come to rule. Do not ask students to take simultaneous notes on new, complex material. If it's not new, fine. If it's not complex, fine. If it's new and complex, don't ask them to write while they're listening. So the reason I create these handouts is as much as possible to reduce the amount of decision-making and note-taking that you need to do. This is my strategy for solving that problem. There are lots of other strategies. You had a question. Oh, and I'm remembering. Look at me go. Oh, and Barbara did too.
Oh, thank you. So I understand it's all developmentally, like what's appropriate at a younger age versus an older age. But what happens if, like, your approach as maybe a high school teacher, you've provided guided notes structured like this to take that demand off, and then the students are more successful, but then they get into, you know, a college situation or a work situation where somebody's not scaffolding in that way, and they haven't like really had the experience of the note-taking or being able to simultaneously do all those tasks.
Great. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
I'm Rachel.
Rachel. Thank you, Rachel. So this is a really thoughtful question. The experience of doing it that way will, even though it's bad, will train them to do the bad thing later on. Each of us is going to come to a different conclusion about that puzzle. Here's my conclusion about that puzzle. I think the best thing I can do to prepare students to thrive in a setting where they're being taught in less efficient ways is to teach them the material as well as I possibly can. So if they get it super well right now, they'll be able to navigate that situation better than if they don't. And the way for me to do that is to give them the notes, help them take the notes in the best way for cognition. So I myself understand the argument, it's good training, but I wouldn't do that. Other thoughtful people reasonably say, yes, they really need that training, I am going to do it. And I don't think that's a crazy position, it's just not something I do.
Where does the actual physical development of the brain come into this? In other words, a student who is in 5th grade and asked to take notes is different from a student who is in college taking notes,
So
I would think.
As is always true, because working memory is developing, in some ways they have more working memory capacity to do that, but at the same time, the material we're asking them to understand is cognitively more challenging. So how to manage that balance, again, each of you will figure that out in the right way for you. Yes, Patricia. Oh, I'm sorry, there's one right here.
I would wonder what the developmental journey is of this regarding working with younger children, because this is something that they will need to navigate as they get older, whether we agree or disagree that this is something that we should be tapping into. Thinking about breaking things down into manageable increments so that if they are asked to take notes, let's say as a second grader, which they are in my class, children learn that they can write just a word, and maybe that becomes a vocabulary word. Someone may write a fragment of a sentence, and we take that information and we see how we can plug that into the content. And so just giving children various ways or experiences of even just jotting something down on paper, if you're listening to a video or if you're listening to a teacher speak or you've read an article, everyone's contribution contributes to the whole, and everyone finds their own entry point. That seems manageable to me because it teaches children in manageable increments how to collect that information, and you can listen and learn about how another classmate has done it, and you can maybe find another entry point. And if you don't find one, at least you've had the experience of knowing what it might look like one day.
So the best answer I have to that is, my point is not do this thing, my point is think this way. I'm not saying, and therefore you must never do this. I'm saying, based on what I know, I think it's unlikely to cause learning in the short term. If you see the underlying skill that they're developing to be more important than the learning of the content, that's a reasonable decision that you get to make. So I am confident about the statement, taking simultaneous notes on new complex material will make it harder to learn the thing. But teachers have other goals than just learning the thing, and if, in your view, those other goals are more important than this goal, you get to make that decision. And if that sounds, I don't know what the word is for it. I mean that very genuinely. I'm not saying, but if you disagree with me, you're completely wrong. I'm very genuinely saying, I really genuinely believe. There are a lot of people in brain science world who say, I actually just wrote about this on the blog. There are people in brain science world who say, we have done the research, do what we are telling you to do. We have done the research, do what we are telling you to do. Cut it out with the judgment. Cut it out with the teacher's instincts. We have done the research, do what we are telling you to do. I'm the guy in the field saying, will you cut it out with the don't trust the judgment? You have to trust your judgment. You have to. No researcher can research all the variables well enough for us to know what to do with it. So the best we can do is understand the general principles that come from research world like working memory, and then rely on teachers to be the best stewards you can be of how to use these general rules in this world. And I deeply trust you to do that. I'm glad we did that. I hadn't realized that was going to be worth digging into so much. All right, a couple more questions came up. One is, what is a learning specialist to do with somebody who's always in catastrophic failure? Oh, wow. Always in catastrophic failure sounds horrible. So come talk to me, but always in catastrophic failure is about as bad a situation as one can imagine. So I guess I would say ring the fire bell, like something dramatic needs to happen. Come talk to me about what to do if you want to explore that more. But don't let that situation continue is the short answer. Is previewing an effective strategy to support working memory? Here's how I would, I don't have an answer. I have a way to think about that. Is previewing going to help students select? Or is it going to help them hold? Or is it going to help them reorganize? Or is it going to help them combine? And the answer is, it depends on what your previewing strategy is. It depends on what the goal is. You will know if the kind of previewing that you're doing helps with those four things. If you think, oh, previewing will help them know what to pay attention to in the reading, so it will help them select, so that's good. That sounds like a plausible theory to me. Go for it. So I have a think this way answer to that question. I love this question. Does it help them develop strategies? Notice the pit the questioner did not fall into. Usually this question goes, we asked them to do a lot of working memory work. Isn't that helping their working memory get bigger? The answer is no, it's not helping their working memory get bigger, so great, we didn't fall into that trap. Is it helping them develop strategies? So that's a really interesting question. I suspect, I was talking with somebody about the experience of watching that science video yesterday, and the person I was talking with said, you know, I realized pretty quickly I wasn't going to follow it, so I sort of thought about it as a storyboard, and I just sort of enjoyed the funny story. So that was a strategy to avoid working memory overload that presumably this person had never studied, just sort of figured out over time, this is the way I think. That was good. So I suspect some of our students just sort of figure out how to do that when we challenge them this way. Yes? Oh, and I'm sorry, microphone.
It helps them avoid working memory overload, but they're also not learning the content in like the case you just gave, right? I mean, it's kind of a choice in that circumstance. Like, I'm not going to go into catastrophic failure, but I'm also not learning about all the cell stuff.
Yeah, so in that particular case, that would have been the result of that strategy, which I suppose just getting the story would be better than getting nothing. So that was a modest improvement.
Right.
Will students learn to manage their own cognitive capacities effectively enough to develop good strategies as well as partially good strategies? I suspect some of them, yes. I suspect some of them, no. When I talk with students, I have a talk for students which I call How to Study Less and Learn More. I actually don't talk with students about working memory because if a student is experiencing a working memory problem, and what I want them to do is think, oh, wait a minute, this is a working memory problem, I should use these strategies. Wait a minute, that was metacognition right there. So the only way for students to use working memory solutions is to be metacognitive, which ramps up the working memory demand. So I think it's unlikely that they will be consciously metacognitively effective about working memory when they need it. So I think working memory is our job more than their job. There's plenty of stuff that's their job. I think we are responsible for managing working memory load. Yes?
As a learning specialist and like working a lot with students with learning needs, I'm wondering, you say that like working memory develops naturally.
Yes.
Are there situations in which working memory is so limited it just doesn't develop? And like, does that feed into learning needs in some way?
So surely yes. That seems to me pretty extreme. But it sounds like it's your experience that it might be happening, and that's a student who's going to need very particular kinds of support. But that's pretty extreme. So are there people who, height is a human variable. We're all at different heights. Are there some people who just stay really, really short their whole lives? It does happen, but it's pretty rare. Okay, that was the review work I wanted to do in working memory world. If more working memory questions are hovering around about there, you can put them up on the parking lots, or you can come talk to me. So we're going to switch over and start thinking about attention. While we do that, was that a question or a, no? That's, stretching is fine. While we do that, introduce yourselves to the other people at your table. And who are you, what do you do? And if you could live in any city in the world for a year, where would you live and why? Go. So I realize, as people have been talking about this, I realize I left out, when I told you my biography, I left out a key part of my biography, which is that I did this. When the Berlin Wall fell, I moved to Prague for a year, and I managed a Beatles tribute band. It was totally cool.
What's their name?
They were called the Dogs, sadly, which I thought was was it, Brady, was that you? I couldn't see who asked that question. Oh, Kevin. So yes, they were called the Dogs, which in Czech is psi. I have no idea why they chose that name. It was a terrible name. But they were these great 15-year-olds, and American tourists loved the idea of adorable Czech 15-year-olds playing Beatles songs, because they didn't know what the words meant, So the lyrics were this sort of chaotic jumble of close but not exactly right. It was totally fun. So managing, by the way, meant I helped them carry their equipment and I taught them English. Yeah, that's what I did for you. Okay, so let us think about the role of attention in learning. So does everybody have the new attention handout? Does anyone not have the new attention handout? Okay, so, oh wait, yes, we're good. Okay, so here is a question I think it is helpful to contemplate. Let us imagine that you go into class on Monday and you say, students, it seems to be hard to pay attention. Why is it hard to pay attention? Why are you finding it hard to pay attention to academic-y sorts of things? So what would your students say? How would they answer that question? This should, I think, be pretty easy to think about. So take a couple minutes, write down 5 or 10 answers to the question, why would students say it's hard to pay attention to academic things? If you'd like to, you could also add a second question, which is, what is it that you see that they might not see? Why do you think it's hard for them to pay attention in an answer that perhaps they wouldn't be able to see for themselves? Maybe you want to say that too. So I suspect this was fairly easy. What sorts of things did you write down? Why do your students tell you it's hard to pay attention? Yes? Oh, that's right. Thank you. See, by the way, which working memory problem am I having with this microphone? Seriously. It's a holding while processing, right? I'm processing the thing, and what I have to hold is the memory to pass it to the microphone, and it's a working memory thing for me.
It's boring.
It's boring. What else would they say?
They're thinking about who they're going to play with at recess.
Oh, who do I play with at recess? I heard a couple of tireds.
You're hungry.
I'm hungry.
I had a fight with my parents.
I had a fight with my parents. I had a fight with my significant other.
We teach in New York City, and there's a lot of extraneous noise and stimuli.
The ambulance is going by.
Sorry. My last class was really complicated and confusing.
I'm thinking about some other class that I'm taking.
My kids complain about the smell in my room.
The smell. So, I mean this in a nice way. Do you teach science?
I do not.
So usually that's a biology thing, right? Usually it's the formaldehyde for the pigs.
It's like the kids in the previous class. They come in and say they smelled.
That I've never heard before.
I don't speak this language.
I don't speak this language. That's going to make it hard to pay attention.
I don't know.
Okay. So each of you will presumably have a somewhat different Bueller list. Presumably the smell thing or the don't speak English thing. There will be variety, but it's pretty easy for all of us to write down that list. So I think we can summarize that little exercise with 2 newspaper headlines. Newspaper headline number 1, we know what the problems are. We just identified them. We know what the problems are. What we want when we go over to psychology and neuroscience world, please, 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 psychology and neuroscience people, please tell us the solutions. We got the problems, please tell us the solutions. Here's the very strange thing I would like to say. I would like to say these headlines are backwards. What I would like to say is, we actually don't understand what the problem is. And once we do understand what the problem is, we already know a significant portion of the solutions. We're good with solutions. The problem is we misunderstand the problem, which is a completely bizarre thing to say because we've been talking about attention since we were 2 or 3. Like, this is not a new word for us. How can we possibly misunderstand attention? I think the useful information from neuroscience and psychology world is to tell us to think a new way about attention. And once we think the new way about attention, what to do will actually be relatively straightforward. How's that for a big promise? I love this slide. This is a level of attention that I have never achieved in my classroom. For my students to attend with the vigor and energy and delight that these students are attending, I've never gotten there. But aspirationally, someday perhaps, my students will attend in this marvelous way. Okay. In order to explain my bizarre claim that we need to think about attention in a new way, I would like to try an analogy. So please imagine that someone buys the piece of property across the street from the school where you work, or across from where you live, and every day as you're going to work, you see that they're building a house, and every day there's a little bit more progress on the house, and you're impressed with, like, there wasn't a house, and 2 months later, there wasn't a house, now there's a house. And you think to yourself, wow, there wasn't a house, now there's a house. The people who built the house did a great job building the house. Go house builders. Here's the bizarre paradox I would like to propose. A house exists, no one built a house. A house exists, no one built a house. What happened is, some people came and they dug a foundation and they left. They didn't build a house, they laid a foundation. Another group of people came and they put up the frame. They didn't build a house, they built a frame, and they left. And another group of people came, and the electricians came, and the plumbers came, and the roofers came, and the cable guy never showed up, right? So different specialists came, and when all of the specialists did their work, the result, when you put it all together, was a house. None of them actually is a house builder. And crucially, if part of the house breaks, you have to call the right specialist to fix it. If your roof is leaking and you call the people who laid the foundation people, like, they don't do roofs. It's not their thing. They're not going to fix the problem. They don't know from roofs. There's no house fixer. You got to call the right fixer. Everything that I just said is true about attention. Attention is not one thing. There is a behavior that we call attention. That behavior results from 3 sub-processes. If all 3 of those sub-processes are happening, the behavioral result is attention. But there's no, quote-unquote, attention center in the brain. There's no thing that's doing attention. So I can't solve an attention problem because an attention problem doesn't exist. So am I right, you're Judy? So if I say, Judy, pay attention, which is my go-to strategy to get students to pay attention. Judy, pay attention. I just told Judy to do 3 things. I did not tell Judy which one she isn't doing, and I did not tell Judy how to do it. So my go-to strategy on helping students pay attention is super unlikely to work very long because it didn't actually fix the problem. I had a problem with the roof, I called the foundation guy. That's the overall concept we're working with. Here's some fun language somebody gave me last month. Attention is an emergent phenomenon. If you get the 3 things, poof, you get this whole new thing called attention. But there's no attention center. Okay, so as teachers, we need to know, what are these 3 things? What do they look like? What do problems with them look like in the classroom, and how do we fix them? So the guy who developed this theory, his name is Michael Posner, and he wrote a book with Mary Rothbart. So this theory is known as the Posner and Rothbart tripartite theory of attention. It's so well established that in my grad school year, I took 8 courses. 3 of the professors took a class to go over this theory of attention. It's very well established. So there they are. The 3 pieces of attention are called alertness, orienting, and executive attention. So let's define them. To define alertness, I think we can call it alertness. How many of you studied psychology at some point in your career? So you'll tell me if you agree with me on this or not. I think psychologists are terrible at naming things. They come up with terrible names. Do you know what Dweck initially called her theory of mindset? Do you know what a growth mindset used to be called? People at a growth mindset are called incremental theorists. People with a fixed mindset are called entity theorists. Does anyone have any idea what theory of mind means? No, you don't. It's a terrible name. It's a terrible, why are you calling it theory of mind? That makes no sense. So, psychologists are terrible at naming things. Alertness is one of the very few times when what they mean when they say alertness is what you and I mean when we say alertness. It's a very basic physiological, how awake is the student? There are two flavors of alertness problems. The first problem is not enough alertness. I teach in high school. That's the one I see, yes? I used to get paid money to teach grammar at 8:10 on Saturday mornings. Yes, Danielle is nodding and grieving with me. You're grieving with me? Are you still paid to do that? Yeah, so not so much with the alertness. The other flavor of alertness problem is too much alertness. This tends to be younger grades, where the students are running around shouting, scissors, 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 right? That's the other alertness problem. Those are the two. Patricia is laughing nervously. Only one? Just one, okay. So alertness means alertness. There are two problems, not enough and way too much. The next category has a key word in the definition, and the key word in the definition is the word perception. When we think about orienting, we are in a very basic, we're not particularly processing anything, we're not doing anything, we're simply, in a raw way, taking information in through our senses. We are perceiving it. In order to point out the importance of perception, I would now like to give you a little quiz on that photograph that I put up and loved. And I would like to emphasize it's very fair for me to quiz you on this photograph. I put it up on the big screen. It was up there for quite some time. I talked about it. I pointed to it. We spent a lot of time in class covering the picture, yes? And then it's been right up there on the board for several minutes now. You had plenty of time to study the picture. This is very fair. So I'm going to ask you 3 questions. Please don't shout out your answers. They're very simple questions. So question number 1, how many faces can you see clearly? Don't shout out. Question number 2, what are they looking at? Question number 3, what color is her shirt? Okay? So here's the headline. At every second that we are conscious, there are vastly, vastly more stimuli in the environment than we can process. At this particular second right now, you are not processing the color of the carpet, although now you are. At this particular second right now, you are not processing the sound that this projector is making, although now you are. At this particular second right now, you are not processing how your left kneecap feels, although now you are. All of that sensory information was available. It's been there all along. It's right there in the environment. You are not processing it, which is to say you are not orienting to it. Okay, close your eyes for a second. I need to check this next slide. Yeah, okay, open. I thought I left this in. I wanted to be sure. So this is indicated in the most fun graphic ever, done by a guy named Tor Nora Tranders. I so wish my name were Tor Nora Tranders. It's a little poem of a name. If you would like to call me Tor, you may do so. I love that name. So here's a question. Let us compare all of the stimuli in the environment to our processing capacity for it. Such a basic question. We shall represent all of the stimuli in the environment with the blue rectangle you see before you. We shall represent our processing capacity for it with the little bitty white rectangle, which you probably hadn't even noticed. There's just, the ratio is extraordinary. So let us go over our little quiz. How many faces could you see clearly? 4-ish, yeah, good. What were they looking at? Beetles of some kind. What color was her shirt? Did you just hear that rainbow we got? So here's what's happening when you process this photograph. Humans are a very, very, very social species. We're among the most social species out there. So the first thing that happened when you saw this photograph is you made eye contact with the kids, which is why you knew pretty well. People will say 3, 4, or 5. You had a pretty good idea of how many children there were. You made eye contact with them. All of them are looking at the same thing, which, by the way, is a dark object against a light background in the center of the photograph. So the first thing you did is you oriented here, and then you oriented here. There was simply no reason for you to orient over here. You just didn't orient there. Notice you didn't have an attention problem. Notice, crucially, you didn't have an alertness problem. You were exactly equally alert for all three of those questions. You had an orienting problem. You oriented to these things and didn't orient to those things. Does it ever happen in your classrooms that students fail to orient to the thing you want them to orient to? Has that ever happened? Notice that's not an attention problem. That's an orienting problem. Okay, so alertness we define as alertness. The key word in the definition of orienting is the word perception. So there are two key words for executive attention. Those two key words are effortful control of cognitive processes. Effortful control of cognitive processes. And because that's fairly abstract, let's do a couple of examples. So this first one is very fun. I suspect many of you have done this before. It's a very common thing to do in psychology world. It's totally fun. In just a couple of seconds, I'm going to put words in each one of these boxes here. And truthfully, the word is irrelevant. It doesn't matter what the word is. Ignore the word. The word doesn't matter. What matters is the color that the word appears in. So what you are going to do is say out loud the color that each of these words is in. So, this might be the word dog, and it's in a pink color. So you wouldn't say dog, you would say pink. And this might be the word table, and it's in green, so you'd say green. Yes? Now, this is competitive. Your goal is to be faster than Emily is, and Emily has practiced this. Emily is an expert at this, so you definitely want to beat Emily, right? So you have to do this out loud. Your goal is to be as fast and accurate as possible. There's a timer in the lower right-hand corner. So as soon as you've done the last word, check and see how fast you were. Okay, it's very competitive. On your mark, get set, go. Okay, everybody got that? Remember your time, remember your time. You got your time? Okay, now we're going to do exactly the same thing again. We're going to do exactly the same thing again. Your goal is to say the color, not the word. There's going to be a timer in the lower right-hand corner. Now you're not competing with Emily, you're competing with you. You're going to see how much faster you got. You've had a chance to practice, so how much faster are you going to get with practice? Okay? On your mark, get set, go. So how much faster were you? So for most people, the second version takes between 2 and 3 times as long. It's just a lot harder to do. And the reason for that goes like this. So when you did this version of the task, when you saw that word, if you are a reader of English, you saw the letters R-E-D, and that automatically produced the answer red in your head. And if you have color vision, you saw the color red. So your brain gave you 2 answers. They were the same answer, so you said it. You got red twice, you said red. When you did this version of the task, now you've got a problem because your reading brain automatically handed you the answer red, and your color vision brain handed you the answer blue. So there's a conflict between them. So what do? You must effortfully control your cognitive processes. You have to take time, and could you sort of feel how that effort went? You could just feel your brain go, this is hard. So that was an example of executive attention. We just basically timed how long does executive attention take for that particular task.
Can you show that first slide again?
Ryan.
I had a different experience there. It was interesting because I knew the exercise. And so the first slide, I did better on the second slide, 3 by 3 seconds, because the first slide messed with me because I was trying to just read the color, not the other. So I felt like I had an extra loop is what it felt like, because I was saying what I should have, but then I was also seeing it was what I said. So then I was like, wait a minute, did I just get that wrong? Whereas the other one, I let my brain go just focusing on colors and got it under 13 seconds. So it was interesting because I felt that extra loop in my head for the first one.
Because you knew the underlying Stroop task.
Yeah.
So you knew what you were looking for.
Right.
That's fun. So that's a classic example of executive attention. As I said, when I was in grad school, I got this theory 3 times. And the second and the third time, I said, okay, professor, I have a question. So I know exactly what an alertness problem looks like in class. Know that really well. I know exactly what an orienting problem looks like in class. Got that. What does an executive attention problem look like in class? And the professor said, oh, it's whenever the students are trying to effortfully control their cognitive processes and failing. No, I get that's the definition. Can you give me an example? Well, yes, an example would be effortful control, cognitive processes, failure. So I've come up with what I think it looks like in the classroom, and I hope you'll like this. I'm actually very pleased with this. So I'm a grammar teacher. We've just done a lesson in class, so let's do a little review of parts of speech. So in this sentence, what is the part of speech for the word poodle? Ryan. And Ryan looks at me, and he looks at the sentence, and he looks at me, and he says poodle is a noun. So I got bad news, I got good news. What's the bad news? He's wrong. It's definitely not a noun. It's definitely an adjective. It's a fancy hotel, it's a new hotel, it's a poodle hotel. It's describing the noun, yes? What's the good news? Yeah, it's almost always a noun. Like, that's a poodle hotel? Are you serious? The word poodle, like, poodling is not a thing. Am I right? So he's wrong, but he's entirely plausibly wrong. He seems to understand what nouns are. Like this, I'm just going to ask a couple more questions. We're going to be good. Imagine an alternate set of circumstances. I say, okay, what part of speech is the word poodle? And Ryan looks at me, and he looks at the sentence, and he looks at me, and he says, well, poodle is a metaphor. Now I have a completely different kind of problem. Metaphor is never the right answer to the question, what part of speech is something? Metaphor is a figure of speech, not a part of speech. So he's just cognitively in the wrong ballpark. So I think the best we've got is getting the answer wrong. That happens all the time in schools. That's normal. We're sort of in favor of students. If everybody got everything right, it's not hard enough. It should be harder, yes? So it's the difference between getting something wrong and thinking the wrong way. The answer metaphor is just thinking the wrong way. As another example of, where did that slide go? I'm missing a slide. So second example. I'm sorry, Allie, you have a question?
Yeah.
Hold.
All right, thank you. So suppose a student has a hard time decoding, like a younger child. If you're showing them something like that on the board, I mean, you wouldn't ask them to do that, but suppose that they can't even read the sentence. That would also be executive attention? Or would that be more orienting?
Well, if they've got a coding problem.
Well, decoding, like reading it.
Right, then that's a reading problem.
But wouldn't that not allow them to even address what it's asking them?
To some degree, that goes back, I think it was Jasper who said, you know, if I don't speak the language, it's hard for me to process this well. They just don't speak that language.
So it's not even with attention.
Yeah, that's a
it's just like they can't even
fundamental
approach.
understanding.
That's sad. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So the second example, somebody asked me this question. So if the question is, what's 2 to the third? And the student says 6, what's the bad news, what's the good news? It's wrong.
They understand how to
It's multiplication. I know that 2 to the third is multiplication. I'm not doing it exactly right, but I'm in the correct cognitive ballpark. If a student looks at 2 to the third and says -1, wait, subtraction? Where did subtraction come from? If the student says 2 to the third is 23, what? I'm thinking about it the wrong way. So this is what you're looking for, not is the student wrong. Students get things wrong, that's normal. Is the cognitive process that got us there just in a different ballpark? So, because attention isn't what we thought it was, because attention is a behavior that results from the right kind of alertness and perceiving the correct stimuli and thinking about them the right way, there's a whole new thing that we need to be good at doing that we didn't know we needed to be good at doing because we didn't know this. And I'm going to call that new thing diagnosis. I do not mean we need to diagnose our students with ADHD. That's not what I mean. What I mean is, when something happens and I open my mouth and say, Lynn, pay attention. When I find myself wanting to say pay attention, that's my cue to me that I need to stop and think. Is Lynn having an alertness problem? Is Lynn having an orienting problem? Is Lynn having an executive attention problem? And once I figured that out, then I'll know what to do next. But I'm likely to call the roofer instead of the plumber if I don't stop and ask what kind of problem it is. Because this is a whole new thing, I want to give you a chance to practice, so I'm going to show you a video. 20 minutes ago, you would have said this is a video of people who aren't paying attention, but you are much more sophisticated now. So you're going to talk at your tables and you're going to answer the question, are you looking at people who are having alertness problems? Are you looking at people who are having orienting problems? Are you looking at people having executive attention problems? Okay?
You are about to take part in a quick experiment. Take a look at this.
This is the failure to notice something that's fully...
So is that volume level okay? Okay.
We often don't notice unexpected things because we're aware of far less of our world than we think we are.
So how much or how little are we actually aware of? We decided to recreate one of Simon's most famous experiments to see for ourselves. Here's the setup.
Our senior series producer, Vin, poses as a lost pedestrian and asks a passerby for directions.
Excuse me, I'm looking for the skyline.
Then, we break the two up, walking through them holding a large sheet of wood. Now watch as I replace Vin.
No, it's a...
You might think people would notice the switch, but almost half the time, they didn't. Of course, that means more than half the time they did. We only tried the experiment 9 times, and by no means was it good science. But we were surprised 4 people didn't notice the switch. In Simon's original experiment, 7 out of 15 people didn't either. So what did...
Okay, so take a minute, chat with each other. Are those people with alertness problems? Are those people with orienting problems? Or are those people with executive attention problems? Okay, diagnose, go. Okay, so usually when I talk with teachers, it actually happened, boom, right at this table right away. A strong answer comes up. So most people say this is not an alertness problem. What would an alertness problem look like here?
We said like not understanding what they were asking based on being like too tired or like
just so dazed I can't even process the question. That would be too little alertness. Too much alertness would be running past screaming Starbucks, 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 right? So not an alertness problem. Most people think it's not an executive attention problem. They seem to be thinking about the problem the right way. They got asked a directions question. They seem to be answering, you know, you have to sort of infer, but they seem to be offering guidance for directions. It seems to be a perception problem. There's a key environmental stimulus that they are failing to perceive. What is the key environmental stimulus they are failing to perceive? The face of the person they're talking to. Why, by the way, didn't they orient to the face? Yeah. The task is the person says, could you show me, can you help me find the thing? So everyone says, oh yes. So they orient here, or better said, the researchers oriented them here, and having been oriented here, they were then tested here. This wasn't an attention problem. If I said, hey, you really need to pay attention, I think those people would have been pretty upset. They were paying attention. They got asked a directions question. They were answering a directions question. It wasn't an attention problem. It was an orienting problem. Tim or Tom?
Tom.
Tom.
I was just wondering in that the fact that the person asking directions was wearing a hat, obscuring the face to begin with, sort of a little, fudges a little bit with they weren't paying attention to the face. Because how much of the eyes, the face, were really available? And I mean, I'm a tall person, so
that would stand out.
If someone's wearing a hat, I'm not seeing a lot of their face.
So it's an interesting point. The flip side of that, which is actually to me super surprising, the two things that human beings perceive about one another subconsciously. So if I show you a face so quickly, you're not even aware you saw a face. There are two things that you will guess correctly even though you don't believe you saw a face. Those two things are gender and race. We perceive those subconsciously incredibly quickly. The two men involved in the study, one of them is Asian, one of them is Caucasian. It's really surprising they missed that switch. This picture, these two guys were the two in the initial study. So that's the study that Simons did. But yes, the hat probably made a difference. Here's a terrifying thing. Simons repeated the study with people dressed as maintenance crew. The miss rate went to 80%. So we definitely get cues from clothing. Okay, we've been sitting for a long time. Let's not do that. So we're going to take a 10-minute break. The only requirement for the 10-minute break is that you have to stand up and walk around. You may not sit still at the table. You have to stand up and walk around. So I got the same question twice at the break, which is a really good indicator that this is something that's important to talk about in the full group. The question was, in that video that I showed of the people walking by with the thing in the thing, they didn't have an attention problem. They were asked, they didn't have an orienting problem. They were asked about directions. They were orienting directions. That's not a problem. They were doing it correctly. So that is absolutely true. The reason to show the video is to wrap our heads around the fact that our capacity to orient to more than one thing is much more limited than we would have thought. And it's entirely plausible for people just to completely miss things that you think they can't possibly miss. So if what you want them is to focus on the directions and they didn't see the face switch, that's fine. They didn't see the face switch. You don't care about that. If the problem is that all they're talking about is how bad the classroom smells, they're orienting to the fact that the classroom smells bad. They're not orienting to what you want them to learn. Now you've got a problem. And the point of the video is to help think about those as divisible things. So thank you to everybody who brought that question up. Because we're talking about the interaction of three different things, having pulled them apart, I want to put them back together. And to do that, I'm going to draw a figure here. This is on your handout if you want to fill this in as we go along. So I'm going to call that rectangle the attentional field. And we are going to fill in the attentional field this way. So the first thing I want to graph are the various stimuli that are available to the student in this environment. So perhaps the student is thinking about classmates, or maybe about lunch, or maybe about what we're talking about, or the shiny thing in the hallway, or the text buzz that just happened. And for each individual student at every second, we can graph the relative salience of each of these stimuli. So for this particular student, the most salient stimulus is that shiny thing in the hallway. And the second most salient stimulus is, and the least salient stimulus is, in my world, this is a 9th grade boy. You know who this student is in your world, yes? Okay. So that's orienting. This student is orienting here and not here. The second thing I want to put on this graph is I want to put alertness levels. And let's imagine that my students start at a nice moderate level of alertness, not too much, not too little. What we see is that that creates a kind of a threshold, and only 2 of the stimuli are clearing that threshold. So this student is consciously aware of the shiny thing in lunch, but not all the other things. In the same way you are not consciously aware of the carpet in the kneecap that was below the threshold. This student is consciously aware of some things, but not consciously aware of all of those other stimuli. Counterintuitively, I'm going to put a low level of alertness there. So if a student is at a very low level of alertness, now none of the stimuli is salient enough to cross that threshold. The student is functionally asleep. What stimulus in this circumstance might be salient enough to cross the threshold? What would, in fact, penetrate the fog that that student is in? Sorry? Some surprising and new thing happening. The fire alarm going off. Justin Bieber walking by in the hallway. Right? That might be salient enough, but these stimuli are not currently salient enough. If we think of a high level of alertness there, now all of the stimuli are over the threshold, and absolutely everything, sort of, Ryan? Yeah? So our goal is to get to a nice moderate level of alertness. Because at a moderate level of alertness, enough stimuli, but not too many stimuli, are crossing the threshold. So that's our step number 1. So we've made some progress. What's the problem that I still have? It's the wrong stimuli. So I don't want it to look like that. I want to rebalance the salience of the stimuli so it looks like that. So step 1 is to moderate the alertness level. Step 2 is to reduce the salience of all of the distracting things. And step 3 is to increase the salience of what we're talking about. So if I've done those 3 steps, now I'm here. So we're really good. And now I want to help them think effectively about the stuff that's over the threshold, and that's executive attention. So we pulled all 3 of those things apart. This is a picture of what happens when we put them all back together. What does it look like when we do that? It looks like that. I want to check in how your brain's doing. I have a little footnote I could do here. So footnote yes, footnote no. Okay. So let's think about ADD and ADHD. How do we graph that? So I said that's bad because there are too many stimuli over the threshold. I said for most students we're looking for that. For many, although not all, students in the world of ADD and ADHD, they simply need more environmental stimuli to feel comfortable. That is too much stimulus for most of us. In the world of ADD and ADHD, I need more stimulus to feel comfortable. That's what the clicking is about. That's what the tapping is about. That's what the rocking is about. That's what the is about. Need more stimulus. A great story I heard at a Learning the Brain conference. There was a student whose ADD was so extreme that there was a lot of grief in teacher world, and the teachers were coming to the administrators and complaining. So there was a team meeting about the student, and 20 minutes into the team meeting, somebody said, "Wait a minute, where's the math teacher?" "Oh, we forgot the math teacher." So they all rushed over to talk to the math teacher. And the math teacher said, "Oh yeah, that really was a problem for a couple of days, but I figured it out. I put Velcro on the underside of the desk." So this teacher figured out the student just needed a little extra tactile something. So the student could get the tactile stimulus from the Velcro, and that's what he needed. So the student was fine in math. So just to be clear, you're hearing me. What I'm saying is all of you should put Velcro on the underside of your desks. Don't do this thing, think this way. Find the way that your student can get the extra level of stimulus that doesn't distract the other students. That will be different for each of your students. Judy.
So in our school...
Oh, I'm sorry. I feel like Oprah.
In our school, the learning specialists at the beginning of the year offer us different tools for sensory stimulation. If a student is rocking or tapping or whatever, they have these cushy balls or rubbery things. I was always under the impression that those were calming, tools for calming, and not for giving you more stimulation. So if you could
it's
clarify.
Calming because I'm at a level of stimulation that is comfortable for me. So I feel more comfortable, and in that way it's calming. The right level of stimulus makes me feel good, so that soothes the behavior. I should emphasize, by the way, my specialty is not atypical cognition. My specialty is typical cognition. Joanna's specialty is atypical cognition. So if you are working with a student with a diagnosis, you should trust your learning specialist and do what they say. This is a way to think about it, but use your local experts because they are experts and I'm not. Okay. I said that once we start thinking the new way, you actually know a great many ways to solve these problems. I'm quite literal about that. I think once we start thinking about attention not as a thing, but as a combination of three things, it turns into a set of very common sense questions, and we generate a whole bunch of common sense answers. So if step number one is to help students moderate their alertness levels, do you work with this every day? You've got students who are, you've got students who are, what do you do? So take a couple of minutes. What are you currently doing to wake up the sleepy students and calm down the hyperactive students? What do you already do? Go. All right, welcome back. So, I suspect given, hold on, don't know what's happening to my voice. Given the vivacity of the conversation, it sounds like you already have lots of strategies to help students wake up or calm down. What are you currently doing to help students wake up and calm down? Barbara, we're in mic mode a little bit, so we might, go ahead.
Have them do some kind of exercise before you start.
For instance?
Jumping jacks or...
Is that going to wake them up or calm them down?
That's going to wake them up.
Would it also calm them down?
Some, yes, yeah. Some students.
So interestingly, most techniques work both directions. The thing you do that wakes some of them up will calm some others down.
What about like breathing and listening to the rain? That's more of a calming for everybody, right?
So I suspect that's likelier to calm than to wake up. So if I wouldn't, like 8:10 on a Saturday morning before I teach grammar, I wouldn't have them do calm breathing exercises because they'd probably just go right to sleep. Excuse me. Great. Other things you're currently doing to wake students up or calm them down?
We actually didn't say this, but I was wondering if, kind of like what we were saying before, if just like a quick writing exercise, and so, like depending on the situation, if it was like you could tell that they were just thinking of too many things, like the dump of what you're thinking about might be good.
So it's interesting. To some degree, that sounds to me like it fits in a different category. What category might that particularly help with?
Like like the attention, the orienting?
Not attention. We don't use that word anymore.
Oh, right. Orienting?
Actually, to me, it's going to depend on the circumstance. To me, it feels a little like an executive attention problem. If the problem is that I have too many thoughts in my head, if I get a minute to write them down, that will help me manage those thoughts more effectively. Yep.
Sometimes just making them aware of their energy level. Sometimes they don't even know that they are sleepy.
Wow, it's really crazy in here today.
Yeah.
Wow, you all seem really tired here today. Have any high school teachers ever said, wow, it's really tired in here today?
We had spoken about this yesterday at the with the folks I was sitting with last night, but crossing the midline activities, if it's crazy, sometimes I'll just be like, everybody get in the center of the carpet, touch your thumbs together, touch your pointer fingers together, and then it's like hypnosis. They're just like.
So this is back to a movement strategy.
Yeah.
So movement really of any kind is good for waking up and calming down. I'm going to put a little asterisk on crossing the midline. This has gotten into the water, and there are people who sell the product. We don't really need to worry about crossing the midline. Everybody's always crossing the midline. The corpus callosum is one of the largest structures in the brain. It's happening all the time. So it's fine that it's crossing the midline, but it's just movement. And you don't need to pay for brain gym to do it. You genuinely don't. Just have them move. It's good.
Is that the same thing with brain yoga?
I've never heard of brain yoga.
Okay.
Or I'll say that differently. There is no such thing as no brain yoga. Right? Both Joanna and I are going to be talking about skepticism this afternoon. So I'm going to give you a way to look into brain yoga. Because A, I've never heard of it, and B, bing, my skeptic, especially, does it cost anything? Okay, well then I'm feeling a little better if it doesn't cost anything. Okay, one more.
Andy?
Oh, yes.
I find just making them laugh, and that's usually to like bring up the energy, because there's some students who just are, you just need to get them engaged, and I also feel like that's important because then they feel like you're of interest. So it's sort of by giggling, it brings, your energy to sort of, I can't think of it brings it up. Yeah. But also then it engages them because they're thinking, oh, what you're going to say may be interesting, actually, for once.
For a change. So, as you can see, we are already solving these problems. We already know what the solutions are. We need to know when to use them. These are the strategies we use when they're having alertness problems, not when they're having orienting problems, not when they're having executive attention problems. If the problem that they're having is executive attention and we ask them to move, if the problem that they're having is orienting and we ask them to move, that's likely to exacerbate the problem, not to solve the problem. So it's aligning the strategy with the actual problem, which is why diagnosis is a thing. By the way, one of the questions was about diagnosis. I want to be really clear. When I say diagnosis, I'm not talking about diagnosis of learning differences. I'm talking about saying that was alertness, that was orienting, that was executive attention. It's figuring out which one of those three it is. Really, the only one of those things we haven't talked about is visual novelty. So I will just say, for neurobiological reasons, visual novelty is great for alertness. We all descended from ancestors who managed to escape predators and to find prey and to find mates, parenthesis, the only three things that evolution cares about. Our ancestors were able to do that because whenever there was a visually novel stimulus in the environment, they alerted to it. So when you're putting a lesson plan together and you think, wow, this is the place I totally lost them last year, that's the time to put the new poster up. That's the time to rearrange the furniture. That's why videos are great for learning. Let me show you my strategy. This is what I did at 8:10 on Saturday morning when I had to teach 15-year-olds grammar.
I've never seen anything like that before. And with any luck, I'll never see anything like it again. No! Play it again. Oh, right.
Oh, stop. I hit play again. So let's imagine I play that video at 8:10 in the morning, and my department head walks by and notices that that's what I'm doing, and calls me into her office at the end of the period and says, Andrew, we're not paying you to show beaker videos. We are paying you to teach the children grammar. How would you defend me?
Oh, hi. That in order to effectively reach all the students in your classroom, you introduce something to get their alertness levels up at the beginning of your class?
They're not going to learn no grammar with the alertness levels they got. So did I waste 90 seconds playing a beaker video? Yes, I did. But because I wasted 90 seconds, I've now moderated their alertness levels so that they can, in fact, demonstrate this behavior that we call paying attention, which will allow them to learn.
Can't that overstimulate? I mean, I'm like, grr.
So who's going to make that decision?
You?
Me?
Of who gets to stimulized by it?
Who's going to decide whether or not that video is too stimulating for the students?
You, the teacher, yeah.
You.
That's what I meant, you.
So if you look at it and you think, wow, that my kids would freak out, don't play it.
But what if there's just some? You know, what if it's really best for...
If this strategy doesn't work, use a different strategy.
Okay.
But isn't there also like an opportunity for like metacognitive learning here? So like if you, and maybe this again depends on the age, but if I have older students, like I want them telling me what they need and what would be helpful to them, right? So like I have students in my class who, you know, in the same way that we might teach like an executive functioning skill, that some kids take notes on note cards while others prefer to do it, you know, online. Like with this, don't you also want them starting to formulate like, oh, when I start to get distracted or I get overstimulated, this tool works for me and this tool doesn't. So can you have like a variety of tools open to your students and make it so that it's not always on the teacher to say this is what you need?
So I suspect you can predict, I'm going to have a couple different answers to that question. Can you predict what they're going to be?
I think it depends on.
Oh.
I think it depends on where they are developmentally, how old they are.
So to some degree, it's going to depend on the students. What else might I say?
Who gets to make that decision?
And who does?
The teacher.
So you will know if that works for you. If it works for you and your students, yes, do it. What is my hesitation? Why am I a little skeptical to imagine it's going to work?
Because I think we're on, check. No? Yes?
Yes.
Yes. All right. Because then you're tasking their working memory more to get them to get a metacognitive level about what's going to work for me. So then that you know, makes it a little bit more difficult for them with their working memory to then attend to the content you're trying to get to.
And I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Perry. So if we've talked about the relationship between how awake a student is and how good their working memory is, it's going to be hard for them to be metacognitively effective at a place where their alertness level is thrown off, because by definition, alertness level thrown off means their working memory is thrown off, so metacognition is going to be especially difficult. That being true, as a matter of general prediction, if you are doing it and it is working, keep doing it. Don't do this thing, think this way. How many of you, if you were honest with yourselves, are more distracted by your cell phones than you think you are? We're just bad at it. We just are. So it would be great if we could train that. It's just hard to do. Ooh, more?
This conversation has me thinking about what role music in general plays with alertness. And I'm a little frustrated because it feels like it's different roles for different kids, and I'm orchestrating the room, so I'd love to hear more about that.
Can we do that another time? Because I want to talk about it, and I want to talk a little bit more about the other chunks. And I promise you I'm going to land the plane on time. So remind me, what's your name? Linda. So please, Linda, remind me at the break, and I'll come back to that. This exercise that we just did, where I said, what are you currently doing to solve alertness problems? You've got a lot of solutions to alertness problems. The next obvious question is, well, what are you doing to reduce the salience of distractors? You could have a good, lengthy conversation about that. The next obvious question is, what are you doing to accomplish step 3? What are you already doing to make the material more salient? Yes, we're already doing these things. So the question, there isn't some sort of magic out there in research world. It's just a different way to organize what it is that you're already thinking and doing. I talked about fluorescent lights yesterday, didn't I? I mentioned that. So here's a story that was very powerful in my teaching world. We renovated a classroom building. We had these cool new fluorescent lights that didn't cost very much and didn't look like fluorescent lights. They were great. So on the first day of renovation, I said, isn't this great? We've got these cool new lights. And my student said, well, yeah, they're great, but that one is making this very high-pitched squealing sound that's hideously annoying. I couldn't hear it. I was 45, right? I'm entirely confident 10 years ago I would have said, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? With the squeal, we're talking about Virginia Woolf, and you want to think about squealing lights? Ignore the squealing lights, we're talking about Virginia Woolf, is what I would have said. Because what do I know from school? Now I think if it is disorienting my students, it is my job to fix it. If it is disorienting my students, it is my job. So I called Abe, and I said, Abe. And Abe came over that day, and he climbed up on the table, and he fixed it. And the next day I said, good news, Abe fixed it. And they said, nope, it's still there, because Abe couldn't hear it either. So I called Abe, and Abe, because he's that guy, came during class and climbed up on the table and fixed it with them listening, so they could say, no, yeah, that's it, that's good, right? So when I said the way I think about teaching radically expands the definition of good teaching, I think Abe was doing really good teaching because he was making it easier for students to orient to what they need to learn, and that's good teaching. It's going to help new content get from the outside world into long-term memory. I do want to look at 2 pieces under the heading of promoting executive attention, because I think that's the most abstract and the trickiest of the bunch. So we're going to skip ahead to that. Okay, so we've talked about moderating alertness levels. We've got some strategies from that. We haven't talked about, but I suspect you could pretty quickly come up with strategies to reduce the salience of the distractors. If the room smells bad, what do you do to solve the problem that the room smells bad? If the technology is disorienting them, how can you help them use the technology in a way so that it's not disorienting them? If the room is cold, I just presented at a conference in Mumbai, where, because it's in Mumbai, they really, really, really believe in air conditioning. And as a result, the people were freezing, which is ironic, but true. So essentially, the only thing the conference organizer and I talked about was turning off the air conditioning. Like, we talked about that several times a day for 3 days, because the people were freezing, which was disorienting. So let's think about promoting executive attention. I'm going to talk about 3 strategies. Strategy number 1, as you think about the difference between getting the answer wrong and thinking about the question the wrong way, which was my test for what is an executive attention overload, you might think to yourself, wait a minute, isn't that basically working memory? Yes, it's basically working memory. So all of the solutions that we talked about for working memory problems are likely to be good solutions for executive attention problems because those are two very similar things. So who was it I called on who got the grammar question wrong? Who got the poodle wrong? Was that you, Ryan? You were sitting there. Doesn't matter. That was you, okay.
Well, you made me get it wrong.
Okay. Oh. Ryan's a little mad at me about this. I think I'm going to get beat up. I'm going to get whitewashed at recess. Right. So is there a way I could reduce the working memory load of that question to make it easier for Ryan to manage the working memory load of that? That would be one way to approach it. Because executive attention means effortful control of cognitive processes, we're in the realm of self-control research. So I want to talk a little bit about self-control research because it's fun and interesting. And if students can improve at self-control, they can improve at executive attention because executive attention is a subcategory. So this is research done by a guy named Roy Baumeister. If we're going to help people manage self-control, we need to understand what sort of thing self-control is. And when Baumeister started working, there was a very clear theory about what self-control was. Self-control was a personality trait. So Tom mentioned a little while ago that he is tall. So there are some people in the world who are tall. They're tall people. There's Muggsy Bogues. He is short. There are short people. Short people are not going to wake up tomorrow as tall people. Tall people are not going to wake up tomorrow. Like, it's a personality thing. So the reason I have some self-control and the reason I don't is it's a personality thing. Baumeister didn't think that was true. Baumeister's hypothesis was that self-control is sort of like a reservoir, that I have some right now, but once I start exerting self-control, I start draining my reservoir, and it gets harder and harder and harder to exert self-control the longer I do so. And then once I stop, the reservoir refills, but the longer I'm exerting self-control, the harder it gets. So here's how he tested this. He had students come to the lab to do 2 back-to-back self-control tasks. So they did the first one, and then they did the second one. Half of the participants did the easy version of the self-control task. So the theory is, I do the easy version, so I've got a less self-control left over, so my reservoir is full. So when I do the second self-control task, I've got a full reservoir, I'm going to be really good at that. Whereas these people, they drained the reservoir, so when it comes to the second self-control task, reservoir is empty, they're going to be really bad at that. What were the self-control tasks? The second self-control task was a very boring proofreading task. There are columns of letters and numbers. You have to be sure they're identical. It's super boring. Nobody is motivated to do it. It takes a lot of self-control. The first self-control task was this study was scheduled at lunchtime, just before lunch, so people show up hungry. There's food in the waiting room, and they're asked not to eat the food. Even though you're hungry, please don't eat. What is the easy version of the task? What's the food that we could put out that would be easy for people not to eat? Vegetables, broccoli, liver. They put out radishes. There was a bowl of radishes. They were asked not to eat the radishes. What is the hard version of this task?
Ice cream.
They had freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. Roasted chicken. Boy, we've gone full lunch here, haven't we? So, sure enough, as Baumeister predicted, the people who resisted the radishes, that didn't take a lot of self-control. They had a lot left over. They were good at proofreading. The people who resisted the cookies, they drained their reservoir, so they were bad at self-control, so they were bad at proofreading. So, good news A, we have a whole new theory about self-control. It is not a personality trait. It is not. It can change. And one of the ways it changes is the longer I exert it, the harder it gets. And that's the first piece of good news. The second piece of good news is we now have a research paradigm we can use to investigate ways to help. So one of Baumeister's graduate students, a guy named Mark Muravin, wondered about the relationship between time pressure and self-control. So he repeated Baumeister's study. For half of the students, when they were doing the proofreading, there was a clock on there just showing the time. For the other half, there was a countdown clock showing them how much time they had left. So artificially inducing a sense of time pressure. Did that make any difference? The answer is, for the people who resisted the radishes, their reservoir is full, they had a lot of self-control left over, it didn't matter. That's not a statistically significant difference there. For the people who had resisted the cookies, their reservoir was empty. Time pressure doubled the number of mistakes that they made. Wow. So notice, when I called on Ryan to say, what part of speech is that, there's a built-in time pressure to that, isn't there? The longer it takes him to answer the question, the more embarrassed he is. So I've created time pressure. Is there a way for me to do that exercise without creating that time pressure? By the way, I only need to do that if I'm seeing executive attention problems, but if I do, that would be a potential solution. You had a question. Oh, Barbara's on it.
This probably is maybe a silly question. I'm having a hard time relating proofreading to a self-control task.
It's a self-control task because it's extremely boring and nobody wants to do it.
Okay.
So you have to force yourself to do it.
Okay.
What part of this, so there's a whole lot to say about self-control. One of the findings is that we don't have different reservoirs for different kinds of self-control. So one kind of self-control is forcing yourself to do a cognitive task you don't want to do. Another kind of self-control is physical self-control, forcing myself to carry the thing I don't want to carry. Another kind of self-control is being nice to people I don't want to be nice to. So all of these things are draining the same self-control reservoir.
So it's not the actual cognitive act of proofreading, it's the like making yourself do it.
Yes, because it's so dull. It's deliberately extremely boring. So that was one strategy to support executive attention. Another strategy to support executive attention, I suspect you're already doing, but it's really nice to have research that says you should keep doing it. So this is another Mervyn study. People might know there's a motivation theory out there called self-determination theory that says people are motivated by three things: a desire for autonomy, a desire for relatedness, and a desire to feel competent. So what Mervyn tried to do was create two different atmospheres, one which promoted those three things, one which reduced them. So half of the participants in this study were in a quote-unquote supportive environment. The experimenter was very supportive, promoted autonomy, promoted relatedness, promoted competence for the participants. And in the other one, don't eat the cookies. Very distant, very controlling. Did that difference make a difference? This is going to look very familiar to you. For the people who resisted the radish and had a lot of self-control left over, it didn't matter. For the people who resisted the cookie and had drained the reservoir, it made a huge difference. So the work that you are doing in your classrooms to create an environment that promotes autonomy, promotes relatedness, and promotes a feeling of competence, those three things are helping in the long run promote the kind of self-control that will help students with their executive attention. This here is the full list. We haven't talked in detail about all of those strategies. If you want a hard copy of this, shoot me an email and I will send that slide to you. Happy to do that. We've got just a couple minutes left. I'm sure there are questions.
A student of mine struggles with self-control. Speaking to someone who did an evaluation, his neuropsych, they told classroom teachers that we should help him practice self-control activities, which now I'm interpreting, though, as possibly depleting this reservoir. And they said that, you know, by practicing these high levels of self-control activities, he would build that muscle. Is that accurate or not?
So, wonderfully complicated question. The answer is using your self-control reservoir drains the reservoir, and practicing self-control makes your reservoir bigger over time.
Okay.
So the goal is to practice the self-control tasks at the times when they've got enough self-control to learn from it, and that it won't interfere with other executive attention tasks that they need to do. So we have lots of research, for instance, people who join an exercise program get better at other self-control tasks when they do it. So yes, that eval is right. The right kind of practice does over time increase self-control. Tom had a question.
On what kind of time scale does that reservoir refill? And I'm thinking about, a typical middle school, high school schedule, 45 minutes, end of the day. Where are we?
So I haven't been asked that question before, and I don't have a research answer to it. I genuinely don't know. I think if you're looking at students and their reservoir is depleted, and you say, okay, we're going to do the funny thing right now. I'm going to show them a video. We're going to move around. We're going to do the thing. Okay, they're back. No, they're not back. I need more. So I think you'll sort of you'll feel your way. I don't know that we're going to be able to get to 8th graders recover this quickly.
I'm curious if it's because again, one of the issues in that sort of 8 periods a day type schedule is just the constant changeover.
Yeah.
So is the changeover between classes enough to refill that reservoir meaningfully? Or is period B teacher already starting at a disadvantage because it's period B?
Anybody else face this conundrum? I think the answer is you will know when you get them where they are. One of my practices, I learned this over the years, but I learned it. For some reason, the school where I worked, we had an hour-and-a-half awards assembly every spring. We can talk in another context about whether or not that's a good idea. The next period was a total waste of time. I always planned to do nothing. Like, I'd show some videos and we'd have a funny conversation. But there was no point in trying to have them learn any Macbeth. Every ounce of self-control they had and would have for the next 12 hours they had used up sitting in the uncomfortable seats being polite to the people they were jealous of. Like, that was a bone-dry reservoir. You'll know.